So welcome to our second podcast on the Panacea project. My name is Dudley Curtis from the European Transport Safety Council, and my guest today is Professor Ashleigh Filtness from the University of Loughborough in the UK. Ashleigh, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to discussing Panacea with you today.
Great. So just a reminder, first of all, about what the Panacea project is all about. So it's an EU-funded research project looking at how to use the latest technology to help professional drivers with their fitness to drive. So that means managing things like fatigue, which is your specialty, stress, alcohol consumption, drugs, and all of these things that can harm road safety if they're not managed properly, especially in the workplace. So Ashleigh, could you start by telling us a bit about your work as a researcher and what your role is on the Panacea project?
Of course. So I'm a professor of transport human factors and sleep science, and I work at the Transport Safety Research Centre at Loughborough University in the UK. So my research field is about driver impairment. So I'm always looking in the driver space, as opposed to like the vehicle or the infrastructure of road safety. But my road safety interest is in drivers and how can we help them in terms of our understanding of the type of things that can impair driving, and then making suggestions to put forward solutions for how we can support people to ensure they are driving safely and we're managing any impairments that they might be experiencing.
Fantastic. So Panacea is all about using data from a range of sensors to help make sure professional drivers are fit to drive safely. And we looked at some of these technologies in the last podcast that we did with Selby from Chalmers University. But today we're going to focus on what we can do with all that data to actually improve road safety. So we're talking about the countermeasures, the sort of interventions we can make with the driver or with enforcement or with transport operators to try and improve the situation when it comes to fatigue and drugs and all the rest of it. So, Ashleigh, could you briefly just explain what a countermeasure is and who countermeasures are for?
The countermeasure is anything that is done to actively try and manage or improve the potential impairment that somebody is experiencing. So these are things that you could target, as you say, towards the driver, but they're also things that can be targeted at an operator or an enforcement agency. But they're the solutions you're putting in place to try and make things better. And for a countermeasure to be effective, it's really important that it is actually targeted at the problem. So that's why Panacea is really good, because as you mentioned, we've got these sensors. So the sensor is able to pick up what is the cause of any particular impairment. So is the person tired? Are they experiencing fatigue? Is it related to alcohol? Is it related to stress? And then once you've identified what it is that's causing that driver particular problem, you can target your solution, your countermeasure, your thing that you're going to do to try and help, and making sure it's actually addressing the thing that's causing the problem.
Okay, so let's try and sort of look at a real world example. Let's imagine that we've got a professional bus driver. We've got some data from the sensors that they're using, which show they're possibly fatigued. What kind of countermeasure have you developed in the project for dealing with that specific problem of fatigue?
So within the Panacea project, we are structuring our countermeasure delivery over 3 different time points. So the intention is that when we identify an impairment, then you've got an operational need to do something now. So in the immediacy, something has been detected, so we've got to do something about it. But then you've got, so to take the example you've given, so we have a fatigue detection technology within the vehicle, so it would give an alert to a driver that they have experiencing fatigue at the moment to try and promote alertness. But then we also have a need for a tactical countermeasure. So this is something a little bit longer term. So it's something that you would do immediately after the shift. So once that driver has stopped their driving, Then in the case of Panacea, we're providing them with a fatigue report. So this happens daily. They get feedback on their alertness across the shift. So this would happen even if they didn't experience fatigue. They would still get a daily feedback on their alertness across their work period. And then we have a strategic level of countermeasure. So this is something that's longer term that could benefit. So things which would be linked more into behaviour change. So looking at, well, what is the longer term cause of fatigue? Does somebody need some help of like insomnia management because they're not getting enough sleep or something like that? So we have those 3 types of countermeasure, but we also, as you mentioned, have the 3 delivery points. So the example you just mentioned is a driver who, as I've said, they would experience those countermeasures as I've kind of just outlined, but then there's also their employer. So their employer would operationally at the time need to know that drivers are fatigued, because then the employer needs to make a decision, well, do I need to swap a driver out? Is that fatigue so dangerous that actually I want that person off the road? And that's their, decision to deal with. And then moving along in terms of tactical strategic, we have other countermeasures. So we've developed a fatigue questionnaire, for example, and this is a tool that the employer can use to have a conversation with the driver. So they can help facilitate or enable the driver to identify what are the things that might be causing them to have fatigue, and then they can work on that together, because some of the things would be things you'd expect the driver would do, such as trying to get enough sleep, and then other things might be things that an operator could consider. So for example, looking at their shift patterns, or has the driver got opportunity to rest? What happens during their break? Have you given them a facility to be able to actually recover? So that it's not just all on the driver.
Okay, that's a really good overview. Thanks. So, sort of going back to when the driver's in the vehicle and the sensors detecting that they're tired, what kind of countermeasure would occur actually while they were driving? What would that be like for the driver? What would actually happen?
So what we're using within the Panacea system is a driver alerting. So it makes an audio noise. Okay. And lets the driver know that they have reached the sensor has detected that fatigue has occurred. So it's an audio noise, and in some of the vehicles which are set up that way, there's also a vibration of the seat, but that's an optional extra.
Okay, and so then when they got back to base, how would they interact with the sort of, you mentioned a kind of report on how their fatigue was during the shift? How would they get that? What would that look like? So
we have we've called it the cloud-based countermeasure system, but it basically just means that it's all held in a cloud-based system, so that the driver's interaction with it is through their mobile phone. So they have an individualized login, and then they can access the details of the countermeasures they've received. So for example, the fatigue report will be in there with the details of their alertness, which, as I say, they receive even if fatigue is not detected. Okay.
And they would get a report, so they could see, for example, that during that journey or today's shift, they received a warning, for example. They would see that in there?
Yep.
Okay, yes. Cool. And then in terms of the tactical stuff and the questionnaire, how would that actually work in practice? Would they fill it out on their phone as well, or would that be literally?
It's a conversation point that you do, because the fatigue questionnaire as a countermeasure is aimed at the operator. Right. So it's a tool for the operator to engage with drivers. So particularly with fatigue, because it's the threshold of fatigue, when is fatigue dangerous, is not as clear cut or as widely accepted as, say, for alcohol. It can be a difficult conversation point, between a driver and an employer. Like, they both know that they've got to be the driver has to be alert and has a responsibility to be fit for duty, but everybody gets tired every day. That's just part of being alive.
Yes.
We all sleep every
having
night.
a busy job or having kids or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not the same as like you can make an active choice not to consume alcohol. You can't make an active choice in a 24-hour period to not get tired. That's just not possible. So the fatigue questionnaire is about having a structured conversation between the employer and the employee around the experience of fatigue and the type of things that are making it worse or making a driver more fatigued. So can you, between you, come up with some approaches to help manage this from both sides?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point you make, because as you say, everyone gets tired, everyone can have a bad day or a bad night, and can just be a bit knackered. But that doesn't mean that structurally they've got, a severe lifestyle problem that needs tackling. So maybe then we could move on from there to one of the other things we're looking at in Panacea, which is drugs. So one of the countermeasures I think you've developed is illicit drug debriefing. Can you sort of translate that to plain English? First of all, what, just for people who don't know, what's a illicit drug as opposed to a drug?
Illicit drug is a medication. So it's a
hay fever drug, for example.
A drug is a substance that you would consume that is going to have an impact on your body. So like a benzodiazepine would be a medication which you would be prescribed by a doctor because you would be expected to take, but it has side effects and might affect your alertness and your driving ability, for example.
So here in Panacea, we're talking about when, let's say, a bus driver may have been prescribed a painkiller medication, which has potentially has an impact on their driving, and how we deal with that. Is that right?
Well, it's broad. In Panacea, we're trying to have a broad conversation about medications. So, for example, it would also include like methadone, for example, as it's a recovering heroin addict might be prescribed methadone, and that wouldn't preclude them from driving, but it's like another thing that they've got to think about as to when they are safe to drive.
Right.
And the impact of that medication. So people should, of course, take medication and follow their doctor's advice. If it is prescribed, you need this medication, but then it's about having that awareness of what potential impact that can have on driving. And it's also then for so the illicit drugs debriefing is aimed again predominantly at the operator, but for the operator having a conversation with drivers around how they can help support self-management of this.
So what kind of questions would you see on that in that conversation? Are we specifying them to that degree, or is it more of guidelines?
So it's guidelines. So for example, it includes some resources to assist the operator. So like information about impacts of medication on drugs, and for their own knowledge, for their own learning. And then it includes some signs of impairment, like what to look out for, and it includes the conversation point to have with the driver. It's the act of, I think, having these things written down in almost like a guide to follow gives a feeling of it's all right to have this conversation. Whereas, of course, it's all right to have this conversation, and it should be absolutely fine for anybody who's employed to be able to talk to their employer naturally and openly about anything. But in practice, that doesn't really happen. But if you put a structure in place, then it just allows that framework in which these conversations can take place.
So we're also looking at working with enforcement authorities in this project, right? So particularly on the drugs and alcohol. So why are we looking at that in the Panacea project, and what kind of guidance are we giving to, are we developing for enforcement authorities on let's say, drugs and alcohol?
So from a countermeasures point of view, we are focusing on the enforcement officers in terms of delivery of roadside checkpoints. So we're working with so the use case that we're working on is in Norway, where the police have the right to random stop to check for alcohol and at the roadside. So that's the space we're working in. And in terms of the countermeasure delivery to the enforcement officers, there's the operationally using a Panacea system. So the actual act of using that as an alcohol detector. So the Panacea alcohol detector is a breathalyzer approach, but it's a new form of breathalyzer where it's able to process the results quickly, and it's more hygienic for the person who is giving the sample, because you don't have to actually put it in your mouth. Okay. It can pick it up from breathing generally without having that more invasive process of putting something in your mouth. And then it's working with the enforcement officers around how would you roll out training or understanding of a new system versus the system that's been used for years, and what are the potential benefits for new technologies in terms of sensors, as you mentioned.
So I think that's another good example of how the research that we're doing with Panacea can kind of be used in the real world. I mean, that's a very direct example. Yeah. Are there other examples? How are we going to use this knowledge and this system we've developed to actually, end up with these kind of techniques and countermeasures and so on being used on the ground by transport businesses around Europe?
So Panacea is pilot testing. So we are trialing out these new approaches, seeing what works and what doesn't work. And then we've made some adaptations for improvement along the way. And then the end outcome of Panacea, we will have this tried and tested system. The countermeasures system itself is very modular, so it's easy to add in additional countermeasures, as things are developed beyond the ones that we've specifically worked on in the Panacea system. So that then it is available, we will share our knowledge and our learnings from this. The individual technology companies who are involved in developing the sensors, they've improved the sensitivity and specificity of their sensors as part of the trial. So that obviously feeds directly into the commercial arm of their operations. So it's information that will then be out there and ready for other people to use. Brilliant.
Well, thanks so much, Ashleigh. It's been great to look at how the project is taking all this data and channeling it into tools that can be used to help keep drivers and other road users safe. So, your research is really crucial because there are so many crashes linked to working drivers in Europe. That's it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. To find out more about the project, search for Panacea Fitness to Drive, and thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Thank you.